The morning sun had just begun to spill over the rolling hills of Tagaytay, painting the wedding resort in soft hues of gold and pink. Inside the main hall, a flurry of activity unfolded. Bridesmaids hurriedly adjusted gowns, groomsmen straightened ties, and caterers moved briskly, carrying trays of refreshments and floral arrangements. Among all this chaos, two people stood quietly, seemingly untouched by the surrounding whirlwind: Daniel Reyes and Mara Santos. Daniel, a 32-year-old man of calm demeanor, had always been the kind of person people described as reliable and grounded. Friends trusted him, colleagues respected him, and his family admired him for his unwavering loyalty. Yet today, a smile that rarely left his face stretched wider than usual. He adjusted his cufflinks for the 100th time. A nervous habit masked his composure. Today was the day he would marry the woman he believed to be the love of his life, the woman who had changed the way he saw the world. Mara, 27, radiated warmth in every step she took. Her laugh was the kind that could fill a room with light. Her eyes held a sparkle of innocence and joy that drew people in. She was family-oriented, close to her parents and siblings, and cherished by her friends for her generosity and kindness. Today, she floated through the resort in her flowing gown, seemingly untouchable by any anxiety. Yet her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the delicate lace of her veil. Today was supposed to be perfect. Today, she would say, "I do," to a man she had loved for years. But weddings are never just about two people. They are the convergence of lives, histories, and relationships. And today's event carried the added weight of one person who had been part of Daniel's life for over a decade: Evan Carter. Evan, 33, a Canadian with an easy smile and a charismatic presence, had been Daniel's closest friend since their college days. They had met in a small university classroom, both far from home, both seeking connection in a world that sometimes felt lonely. Over the years, Evan had become more than a friend. He had become like a brother, a confidant, someone Daniel trusted implicitly. He had laughed with Daniel, cried with him, and even helped him through moments that tested his resolve. It was no surprise that Daniel had invited Evan to the Philippines, to stand as his best man, to be at his side on the most important day of his life. Evan's arrival had been met with the typical fanfare reserved for close friends who traveled far distances: warm hugs, shared memories, and endless stories that echoed through the resort halls. At first glance, Evan seemed like the perfect addition to the wedding, a charming, outgoing presence that balanced Daniel's reserved nature. He joked with the groomsmen, engaged effortlessly with Mara's family, and even offered to help with last-minute decorations. Everyone assumed he was simply the reliable, fun-loving best friend that Daniel had always described. As the morning progressed, there were small moments that seemed ordinary, but would later take on a weight of significance. Daniel and Mara shared quiet smiles while standing apart from the bustling activity, exchanging whispered words about how excited they were to start their new life together. They spoke about the honeymoon they had planned in the mountains, the home they would move into after the wedding, and the family they hoped to start someday. Each word, each laugh, each glance was a brick in the foundation of their shared dreams. Meanwhile, Evan moved through the crowd with ease. He greeted the families, complimented Mara on her gown, and reminisced with Daniel about college escapades. He appeared fully engaged, genuinely happy for the couple. Yet there was an undercurrent of something that went unnoticed in the rush of preparations. A subtle intensity in his gaze whenever he looked at Mara, a lingering pause when she laughed at Daniel's jokes, a shadow behind the charm that nobody else seemed to notice: Daniel. Oblivious to the quiet tension beneath his best friend's demeanor, focused on ensuring the day went smoothly. Mara, too caught up in her excitement and nerves, never paused to question it. Their families, busy with arrangements and photographs, never saw the small, almost imperceptible gestures, the slightly too long smiles, the fleeting moments where Evan's hand lingered on a chair or a railing. By the time the ceremony was set to begin, the sun had risen higher, warming the resort and casting long, soft shadows across the manicured lawns. Guests began to gather, laughter and chatter filling the air. Daniel adjusted his tie one final time and glanced at Mara, whose eyes met his with a mixture of love and anticipation. Evan stood nearby, ready to perform his duties as best man, to toast, to guide, to support. No one knew that today. A day meant for joy and celebration would soon be shadowed by choices and actions that none could have predicted. In that quiet, fleeting moment, as Daniel and Mara shared a look that spoke of lifelong promises, everything seemed perfect. The birds chirped, the flowers swayed, and the world felt in harmony. And yet, hidden beneath the laughter, beneath the smiles, and beneath the celebrations, an invisible thread of tension had already begun to weave itself through the day, an unnoticed, quiet whisper of the storm that was slowly approaching. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the resort, the energy shifted from excitement to subtle tension. Guests mingled on the lawn, glasses of champagne in hand, laughter punctuating the warm air. The ceremony was only hours away. Yet, an unspoken current of unease began threading itself through the day. It started small, almost imperceptible, but for those paying attention, the cracks were there. Evan Carter moved among the crowd with practiced charm. He laughed at jokes, offered advice to nervous groomsmen, and complimented the bridal staff on their decorations. To everyone else, he seemed like the perfect best man, attentive, engaged, and completely trustworthy. But there were moments that Daniel, in the flurry of excitement, didn't notice. The way Evan's gaze lingered a little too long on Mara's face when she smiled at him. The subtle tightening of his jaw whenever Daniel spoke to Mara. A fleeting look of something unspoken, almost imperceptible, yet loaded with intensity. Meanwhile, Mara's energy, though bright and joyous, carried a hint of nervousness that was invisible to most. She had grown up in a family where appearances mattered, where celebration and decorum were paramount, and she smiled through her unease. But in the quiet moments, when she adjusted her veil or spoke to her sister, there was a brief flicker of discomfort whenever Evan approached. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was simply pre-wedding nerves, a natural tension that always came before such an important day. Daniel, focused entirely on orchestrating a perfect wedding, remained oblivious. His mind raced through checklists, seating arrangements, and the final touches for the ceremony. He was the calm in the storm, ensuring every detail went smoothly. He laughed easily, told stories from his college days, and occasionally threw a glance toward Mara, who returned it with a soft, reassuring smile. In those moments, the world seemed simple, clear, and safe. Yet, the first subtle signs of discord began to appear. It started with small actions, ones that could easily be dismissed as coincidence. During a casual conversation, a guest noticed Evan standing too close to Mara, while Daniel was distracted. He laughed, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. Another moment. Mara's cousin overheard Evan speak to her in a tone that sounded almost commanding, almost insistent. But she quickly brushed it off, smiling and nodding politely. Later, as the bridal party gathered for photographs, the photographer's assistant noticed Evan moving around Mara with a precision that seemed deliberate, almost too attentive. He adjusted her bouquet, brushed a stray hair from her face, lingered slightly longer than necessary by her side. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing anyone could pinpoint, just a tension, a sense that something was slightly off. By mid-afternoon, The pace of the day was both exhilarating and exhausting. Guests were settled into their rooms, flowers were arranged with meticulous care, and the staff buzzed with activity. Daniel, preoccupied with coordinating last-minute details, didn't see the subtle undercurrent of jealousy and obsession beginning to emerge in Evan. Evan's smiles had grown tighter, his charm more calculated. He laughed and joked with Daniel, but there was an edge beneath it, a quiet restlessness, a shadow of something Daniel would never suspect. Mara, for her part, continued to radiate warmth and energy, but she began noticing small things too. A glance from Evan that lingered, a hand placed where it didn't belong. A tone in his voice that hinted at frustration. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that weddings were stressful and that Evan was simply overexcited. She had no reason, not yet, to suspect the true danger beneath the friendly facade. A few hours later, while the groomsmen were busy rehearsing their roles, Evan slipped away briefly, claiming he wanted to check on some arrangements. Daniel, engrossed in a conversation with a family member about seating plans, didn't notice. Evan's absence went unremarked, another small thread in a web of tension that was slowly tightening. It was during this quiet period that small incidents began stacking, almost imperceptibly. A staff member saw Evan entering Mara's preparation room without knocking, claiming he was just making sure she had everything she needed. Mara had been adjusting her gown at the time, startled by his sudden entrance. She laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the awkwardness, and Evan smiled politely. But behind that smile was a fleeting intensity that no one else could have interpreted. Later, Daniel recounted a story to Evan about their college days, something meant to lighten the mood. Evan laughed and nodded, but Daniel noticed nothing of the storm brewing behind his friend's eyes. The camera of the mind, the narrator's eye, sees it. Subtle pauses, a flicker of irritation, a deep, almost imperceptible tightening of Evan's posture. These small actions, invisible to the busy wedding party, were all signs of the tension that would soon erupt. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, the stage was fully set. Mara's nervous energy, Daniel's distracted calm, and Evan's simmering intensity had combined into a perfect storm of tension. Guests chatted and laughed, unaware of the quiet undercurrent of something dark weaving through the day. Flowers swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the air carried the scent of celebration, of joy, and of a tragedy that had yet to unfold. The sky over Tagaytay had begun to shift, the golden warmth of the afternoon slowly giving way to the soft purples and muted blues of early evening. Shadows stretched across the resort grounds, draping the meticulously arranged tables, the colorful flowers, and the happy guests in a quiet, almost ominous calm. Inside the bridal suite, Mara adjusted her gown one last time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming excitement and nerves that came with the day she had dreamed of for years. Outside, the laughter and chatter of guests continued, a bright and joyful sound that seemed to exist in a world far removed from the one that was about to unfold inside these walls. Evan Carter, the groom's best man, had been unusually quiet over the past hour. His earlier energy, his jokes and laughter, had been replaced with a quiet intensity that Daniel had not noticed. At first, it seemed like pre-ceremony nerves, but as the minutes ticked by, that subtle restlessness grew heavier, almost palpable. Guests moved through the corridors, exchanging pleasantries, unaware of the storm simmering just out of sight. Daniel, still preoccupied with last-minute checks for the ceremony, had no idea that the day's first real cracks were forming. He had seen Evan quietly step away for a moment, assumed he was checking on a minor detail, and turned his attention back to Mara's mother, discussing seating arrangements for relatives arriving late. Meanwhile, Evan had slipped down a quiet corridor, his footsteps muffled against the polished floor, his mind racing with thoughts no one else could understand. In the suite, Mara was speaking softly with her sister, sharing stories about their childhood and laughing nervously at memories that felt both distant and immediate. She didn't notice Evan linger outside the door, listening, his gaze fixed on her in a way that felt too intent to be casual. His charming smile, always so easy, was now tight, almost forced. And in that quiet moment, a sense of unease settled over Mara. A subtle whisper at the back of her mind, telling her that something wasn't right. The turning point began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Evan's hand brushed against the doorframe as he leaned slightly forward, ostensibly to see if everything was ready. Mara looked up, startled, but smiled politely, assuming it was simply his attention to detail. He nodded, backing away, but the tension lingered, invisible to everyone but the narrator's eye, like a storm cloud on the horizon. Minutes passed. Daniel walked the halls with a sense of responsibility, checking that the rooms were in order, that the staff were aligned with the schedule, that the flowers, the tables, the music, all elements of the perfect wedding, were in their proper place. He was a man in motion, solving problems, ensuring that everything went according to plan. And all the while, the invisible thread of tension between Evan and Mara was tightening. It wasn't until the reception area began filling with guests that the first unmistakable sign appeared. A member of the staff noticed Evan slipping away once again, moving down a side corridor that led toward the more private suites. He told a friend he was checking on something, but no one followed him. By the time Daniel glanced toward the hallway, Evan had disappeared, leaving behind only the faint sound of his footsteps fading into silence. Then came the first real confrontation. A staff member, moving quickly through the hall, saw Mara leaving the main reception area, heading toward the suite. Her expression, bright and excited moments before, now carried a hint of nervousness, almost as if she sensed that something was amiss. Daniel, focused on greeting guests and coordinating photographers, did not notice the subtle tension that Mara carried. Evan, however, moved in the shadows, following, timing his movements with precision. It was here that the subtle unease escalated into something heavier. Outside the suite, Evan paused, his mind racing with conflicting emotions, jealousy, obsession, and a sense of entitlement that no one could have predicted. He opened the door slowly, ensuring no one saw him enter. Mara, inside, adjusting her gown and laughing softly with her sister, turned at the sound. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and there was a tension, a pause in time that neither of them could articulate. Daniel, meanwhile, had begun to notice something was off. He glanced toward the hallway, expecting to see Evan returning, and instead found it empty. A small worry pricked at the back of his mind, but he dismissed it, assuming his best friend was simply performing his duties. He returned to Mara's mother, laughing lightly to cover his unease, unaware that the calm of the day was about to shatter. The next sequence of events unfolded with terrifying quietness. Mara's laughter faltered as she sensed an unfamiliar energy in the room. Evan's presence, though silent, carried an intensity that made the air feel heavier. A misstep, a door slightly ajar, a pause in the music, small, ordinary details. Yet in that moment, they held the weight of impending catastrophe. And then, as Daniel coordinated a final check with the staff, a faint, muffled sound reached the corridor outside the suite. It was almost imperceptible, a sharp intake of breath, followed by silence. No one noticed, except for the narrator, who could feel the world tilting on its axis. The perfect day, the day filled with laughter, dreams, and promises, was now poised on the edge of irreversible tragedy. From this point, the tension ratchets higher. The groom is unaware of the danger creeping closer. The bride senses an undefined unease. And the best man, the man trusted above all, carries within him the intent that will unravel the lives of everyone present. The turning point is complete. The day has shifted, and the descent into horror has begun. The evening air had grown cooler, carrying a hint of rain from the mountains beyond Tagaytay. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the resort bathed in soft twilight. The guests, still laughing and celebrating, were unaware that the world of Daniel Reyes and Mara Santos was about to shatter forever. Inside the suite, Mara had been preparing for the final moments before the ceremony, adjusting her veil, checking the intricate lace of her gown, and straightening the bouquet she would carry down the aisle. The room, filled with the faint scent of roses and polished wood, seemed serene, ordinary. But behind that tranquility, a tension had begun to rise, a tension that would soon become chaos. Evan Carter had returned silently, almost imperceptibly, stepping into the suite with the careful precision of someone who knew he was crossing boundaries no one would forgive. He moved with a quiet confidence, his presence overwhelming the room without a sound. Mara, sensing something in the shift of air, turned, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. It was the moment she instinctively knew something was wrong, but before she could act, events spiraled beyond her control. Outside, Daniel was checking on the final seating arrangements, unaware that his best friend, the man he trusted above all others, had entered the private space where his bride waited. Guests were laughing in the hallway, oblivious to the storm building just meters away. The only witness to the impending tragedy was the silent narrator, watching the tension stretch taut, like a thread ready to snap. And then, it happened. The room, once filled with soft, nervous excitement, erupted into chaos. Mara's startled cry barely had time to echo before the space around her became charged with fear. Objects were knocked over in the scramble. A chair tipped. A glass of water splashed across the polished floor. Every sound, the soft clatter of items, the sharp intake of breath, the rush of movement, was magnified, etched into the minds of those who watched and listened. Daniel, drawn by an instinct he could not explain, turned just as he heard the faintest of sounds from the suite. His heart began to race. He called Mara's name, the sound of his voice echoing through the hallway, but no answer came. Panic prickled at the edges of his mind. He ran toward the room, each step heavier than the last, the joyous music from the reception fading behind him. When he reached the suite, the door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, and the scene that greeted him stopped his heart in its tracks. Mara lay on the floor, motionless, her eyes closed, her body still. The bouquet she had carefully arranged was scattered across the carpet. Petals torn and crushed. The room bore signs of a struggle, not overtly violent, but the subtle chaos of a confrontation. A chair out of place, a glass tipped over, personal items displaced. Evan's presence was immediately apparent. He stood near the corner, breathing heavily, his expression unreadable. Daniel's mind could not reconcile what he was seeing. His best friend, the man he had called brother for over a decade, stood over his bride, the one person Daniel had trusted to protect her, not harm her. Time seemed to freeze. Every sound, every heartbeat echoed in Daniel's mind. The chaos outside the suite became audible now. Guests and staff, drawn by the commotion, began to gather, their voices rising in confusion and alarm. Daniel's voice, filled with desperation and disbelief, called out Mara's name again, but it was too late. The room, once filled with laughter and celebration, had become a chamber of grief and horror. Step by step, the events of the day's final moments began to align in Daniel's mind. He pieced together the subtle signs he had ignored, the lingering glances, the moments of tension, the small gestures of Evan that now seemed ominous. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. This was no accident. This was intentional. The man he had trusted had crossed every boundary, shattered every expectation, and ended the life of the woman he loved. Neighbors, staff, and relatives arrived, drawn by the noise, the uncertainty, and the faint cries that had reached the corridor. Shock rippled through them as they took in the scene. Mara, lifeless on the floor. Daniel, frozen in disbelief. Evan, standing silently. As though the gravity of his actions had not yet fully penetrated the reality around him. As the police were called, the narrator could slow the moment for the audience, describing each detail without descending into graphic language. The overturned chair, the scattered flowers, the single shoe lying askew on the floor, all symbols of a life interrupted, of a moment in time forever changed. The police would later reconstruct the timeline, noting the path of events leading to this instant. But for now, all that existed was shock, grief, and the raw immediacy of betrayal. Daniel fell to his knees beside Mara, shaking her gently, calling her name, willing her to respond. Her silence screamed the truth he could not yet fully accept. He looked toward Evan, disbelief etched into every feature. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why?" The room, once filled with joy, was now suspended in horror. The laughter and music from the reception seemed a distant memory, replaced by the quiet hum of police radios approaching and the low, stunned murmurs of the guests. Every eye in the room was fixed on the tableau before them, every heart heavy with grief, every mind struggling to comprehend how a day meant for celebration had turned into a night of tragedy. The night had fully descended over Tagaytay, and the once celebratory wedding resort had been transformed into a scene of confusion and despair. Sirens wailed in the distance as police and emergency responders arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness like cold, piercing beams. Guests were guided away from the suite, murmuring anxiously among themselves, while staff struggled to piece together what had just occurred. The air was thick with tension, the kind that lingers long after a shocking event, settling in hearts and minds alike. Daniel Reyes stood at the edge of the suite, his face pale, his hands trembling, struggling to breathe through the shock that still gripped him. He watched as the police began their methodical work, taking photographs, dusting for fingerprints, noting the positions of every object, the tilt of every chair, the scattering of flowers across the floor. In his mind, every detail of the day, every seemingly innocuous moment, replayed in agonizing clarity. Evan's lingering glances, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the subtle tension that Daniel had failed to notice until it was too late. The investigators worked carefully, speaking in calm, measured tones. Yet even their professionalism could not mask the gravity of the scene. Witnesses were interviewed one by one, the bridesmaids, the groomsmen, family members, hotel staff. Each had noticed something odd, a small inconsistency, a gesture or glance that had seemed unimportant at the time. Now, in the quiet scrutiny of law enforcement, those small details began to take on new significance. It was then that the first cracks in the story began to appear. A staff member mentioned seeing Evan near the suite just before the commotion. Another recalled him slipping away from the reception for a few moments, his movements unusually deliberate. A guest whispered about noticing Evan's expression, an intensity in his gaze that had seemed out of place, almost obsessive. These observations, harmless in isolation, now coalesced into a chilling pattern. Daniel, desperate for answers, demanded to know where Evan was. The police explained that he had left the resort moments before their arrival, though surveillance footage captured him walking briskly toward the service roads. Daniel's heart sank. He had invited Evan into his life, trusted him with his happiness, and now his best friend was unaccounted for. Potentially, the very person responsible for the unthinkable. As the night deepened, the investigation uncovered more unsettling revelations. Background checks revealed that Evan had previous complaints lodged against him in Canada, situations involving aggression and manipulation that had never escalated to serious legal consequences. Daniel's mind raced. How could he have never known? How could the man he had considered a brother harbor such darkness? Then came the first twist. A witness, a young staff member, hesitantly came forward. He had heard an argument between two voices in the suite shortly before the tragedy. One was Mara's, frightened, pleading, commanding attention. The other was male, stern, and unyielding. The witness had tried to ignore it at the time, assuming it was a minor disagreement, a pre-wedding jitters. Now, under questioning, the details became chillingly significant. Meanwhile, a cryptic message arrived on Daniel's phone. He recognized Evan's handwriting. It read, "You never understand. You never have. Some things can't be forgiven." Daniel's mind reeled. His best friend, the man he had relied on, was taunting him even from afar. Every element of trust, every shared memory, now seemed twisted by betrayal. The investigation continued, peeling back layer after layer of the events leading to Mara's death. Security footage confirmed Evan's movements, the way he had lingered outside the suite, his entrance, the hurried exit. It was methodical, precise, deliberate. Daniel felt sick realizing the magnitude of the planning, the cold calculation. The man he had celebrated alongside had orchestrated destruction with meticulous intent. Then came the final, most devastating twist. Evan had hidden nearby after leaving the resort, waiting, watching, and manipulating events with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to avoid detection. The authorities tracked him to a small, secluded area just outside the property. When confronted, Evan's demeanor was unsettling. He was calm, composed, almost eerily emotionless. And yet, behind his eyes, a tempest raged, a mixture of remorse, obsession, and defiance. During questioning, Evan's confession emerged piece by piece. He admitted to confronting Mara in the suite, to an act of violence that escalated beyond anyone's anticipation. The details, though carefully measured, left no doubt. He had violated the trust of those closest to him, committing an irreversible act that destroyed multiple lives in a single night. Daniel, standing on the outskirts of the investigation, listened in stunned silence. Every revelation compounded his grief, every fact a new weight pressing down upon him. The twists didn't end there. Evidence of manipulation, attempts to mislead the investigation, and small deceptions, like changing the time of his exit, removing fingerprints from surfaces, painted a picture of premeditation. Evan's careful orchestration of events had been unnoticed, masked by charm and the chaos of the wedding. The audience begins to understand the chilling reality. This was no spontaneous act. It was calculated, deliberate, and terrifying in its precision. As the night progressed, the investigators pieced together the timeline, reconstructing the tragedy with painstaking attention. Every small action, every subtle gesture, every overlooked warning, Evan's obsession, Mara's unease, Daniel's blind trust, formed a chain leading inevitably to the outcome. The narrative of betrayal became clear, yet the emotional impact remained raw, a heavy weight pressing on all who observed the story unfold. The dawn was beginning to break over Tagaytay, though the night's horrors had left the resort cloaked in an invisible shadow. The guests had departed, leaving behind whispers, disbelief, and grief that would linger for years. The investigators had completed the initial examination of the scene, But the full story, the truth behind Mara's death, and the betrayal by someone she had trusted, was now emerging in stark, unflinching clarity. Daniel Reyes sat in a small, dimly lit room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring at nothing. The events of the past 12 hours weighed on him like a physical burden. He replayed every moment of the day in his mind, each detail now sharp, precise, and haunting. The smiles, the laughter, the joyful toasts, they were all fragments of a world that no longer existed. Evan Carter had been located, apprehended by authorities in a secluded area just beyond the resort. His demeanor was calm, almost eerily composed, yet the eyes, those eyes Daniel had once trusted implicitly, revealed the storm within. The confession had come slowly, piece by piece, each admission cutting deeper into Daniel's heart. Evan admitted to confronting Mara in the suite. He revealed the intense feelings of jealousy, obsession, and distorted sense of entitlement that had driven him to cross every moral and legal boundary. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and cold. The investigators detailed the timeline meticulously. Evan's movements, his manipulations, the small lies intended to mislead anyone who might have suspected him. Daniel, struggling to absorb the magnitude of the betrayal, listened as authorities explained the consequences. The legal system would take its course. Charges of assault, violation, and ultimately murder were being filed. Evan's past behavior, small incidents, warnings, and complaints that had seemed inconsequential, was now scrutinized as part of a chilling pattern, evidence that the act had not been spontaneous, but premeditated. As the investigation concluded, the emotional weight of the event settled on everyone involved. Daniel had lost the woman he loved, the bright, joyful presence who had been the center of his life. Mara's family grieved deeply, their trust in the world forever altered. And Evan, once a man Daniel had called brother, now faced the stark reality of accountability, of punishment, and of isolation for his actions. But the revelations did not end with legal consequences. Small details emerged, gestures, glances, warnings that had been overlooked. Family members recounted moments that, in retrospect, carried ominous significance. Staff members described subtle shifts in behavior that had gone unnoticed. The audience now understands that tragedy often hides in plain sight, in the things we choose to ignore, in the moments we write off as insignificant. In the quiet of the aftermath, Daniel finally allowed himself to speak, his voice breaking. I trusted him. I believed in him. And now, she's gone. The person I loved most. She's gone because I couldn't see the truth when it mattered most. The investigators had pieced together every fact, every subtle clue, every act that led to the crime. Evan's premeditation, his manipulation, his betrayal. Everything was undeniable. Justice, as it would eventually be served, was meticulous and firm, ensuring that no detail, no action, went unexamined. For Mara's family, there was no consolation that could bring her back. But in the legal reckoning, they found a small measure of closure, that the person responsible had been identified, held accountable, and would face the consequences of actions that could never be undone. The sun had fully risen over Tagaytay, casting light on the resort grounds that had been the setting for both joy and unimaginable sorrow. The flowers, once bright and celebratory, seemed muted now under the weight of memory. Chairs stood empty. Tables remained untouched. And in the quiet, a profound stillness had settled over the place where a wedding had turned into tragedy. Daniel Reyes walked through the hallways alone, the echoes of laughter and music from the previous day haunting him. Each step reminded him of what had been lost, the life he had dreamed of sharing with Mara, the future they had planned. the trust he had placed in someone he had considered a brother. The weight of betrayal pressed on him, almost physical in its intensity. But in that same weight, there was a lesson that could not be ignored.